it's tendentious, who the government chooses to go after in the first place in such cases. If the government prosecuted and deported everybody who lied on their immigration papers, like the population of this country would be like 10 million. This is, they really, it's a matter of choosing to find a pretext to oust somebody in the first place, and then some matter of illegal activity always comes after, right? So it's always the witch hunt that precedes the illegal activity, or the supposed illegal activity, it's remarkable to me that how sophisticated and effective Palestine activism is on campus these days, and how wonderful and intelligent the students are who organize it and participate in it. But it's likewise remarkable to me that those students often need lawyers, that simply organizing around a particular policy issue of interest to them often results in criminalization, and that's a deeply troublesome phenomenon. But when it happens to a place like Loyola Chicago, when they end up on probation for a year, I think there are lots of responses we can have to that might be productive, but one that comes to mind for me is I was setting up an event with them, for next semester, and they wrote me and told me that they don't have funding, and that they won't be able to do it. And so, I wrote back and said, well, I'll do the event for free. I'll arrange travel by other means. I'll come to campus. Their professors can reserve the classroom space, right? And they can hold their events as planned. So maybe when an SJP chapter gets shut down, we can, with some level of critical mass, perhaps, continue to organize events on campus, right, to at least keep the movements going, and sort of pitch in that way, as a showing of support, and of course as a showing of defiance against, against overbearing administrators. And then it also, when Yaman talks about the types of activism that are being suppressed on campus, a lot of them are really creative. I feel like Palestinian students lining up to sign up for Birthright is particularly clever, right? Just a lot of the things that they do. But the Zionists don't simply want to disrupt our politics. We have to keep that in mind. They also want to shut down our imagination, right? They want to shut down the creative, clever ways in which we come into engagement with a certain sort of politics. It's part of a broader process of I think these institutions, wanting us all to become corporate automatons, right? They want us to be unthinking subjects. They want us to be incapable of thinking about novel and interesting ways to challenge conventions of thought and law and politics and so forth. It all goes back to an appeal to authority on the part of Zionist activists, or pro-Israel activists, if you will, on campus. Where they are unable to defend Israel in the public arena, and it's my contention, I think a lot of people's contention, that Israel is becoming more and more difficult to defend, and I'll speak about that in just a second. They end up relying on punitive modes of authority to prevent the conversation or the debate from happening in the first place. So it's important to, I think, to keep our activism and our work in conversation, right, with discourses and philosophies that reject the exercise of state power through laws, policing, surveillance and so forth. We can't, in other words, just be reliant on forms of institutional authority to proffer or provide justice, because it's often those sites of authority where injustice is institutionalized and practiced. When I say that Israel is becoming increasingly difficult to defend, I'm drawing my cue really from what I hear Israel's ostensible defenders saying recently. During the wide-ranging debate that we had, that many of us conducted around the ASA boycott resolution, which was around exactly a year ago, right? Around exactly, which was a year ago. I noticed that opponents of the resolution weren't actually defending Israel, or they weren't deigning to defend Israel. They were simply opposing boycotts and what they conceptualized as some matter of principle, right? That it singles Israel out, right? That's the one that we've all heard a million times, you know. I find that a particularly annoying argument, not only because it's so stupid, but because you know, Israel has worked hard for decades to make itself sound exceptional, right? And then it has the audacity to say you're singling this out. You know, you singled yourself out. You know, way before we ever dreamed of doing such a thing, right? You're the one that told us you're a light unto the nations and better than everybody else, and that you represent a higher standard of morality. Leaving that as a rant over / our hashtag rant over. You know, but you know, they were also saying, you know, why don't you boycott North Korea? You know, what about China? You know, because you know, nothing makes a Zionist more compassionate about the suffering of people in Tibet and North Korea than criticism of Israel, right? You know, that really tugs at their heartstrings. But nobody was saying, or very few people were saying, the claims that pro-BDS folks are making about Israel are false. They weren't actually defending Israel, or they were defending Israel in sort of a roundabout way by not actually defending what Israel does, right? You saw it also during Operation Protective Edge. I saw very little, although I did see some, but I saw very little pro-Israel argument saying that what Israel was being accused of wasn't happening. You know, most of them would grudgingly acknowledge that children were being killed by the dozen, that UN shelters were being bombed, that hospitals were being bombed, that schools were being bombed, that the population was suffering. The population of Gaza was suffering tremendously, right? That really wasn't in much contest, right? They were merely blaming it on the Palestinians. Like, they were saying, well, it's Hamas's fault that the Palestinians are suffering so much, or the old colonial trope that the Palestinians are making us act in such a way. So yes, there's violence, but that violence is not our responsibility. It's the responsibility of the Palestinians, and it's a terrible argument, morally, intellectually, you know, in every way you can think of. But the point is, there was no real defense, right, of the behavior of Israel. There was merely an outsourcing of the responsibility for that behavior. So Israel is becoming more and more difficult to defend, right? And so sort of tactics, which as I think Yaman and Dima did a great job of pointing out, can become hysterical, right? You know, in some cases, begin to rely on sites of institutional authority to intervene where an honest intellectual argument stands no chance. This is, you know, I guess a final point then, because my time is running out, and I'm sure your patience as well. I think it's important to think about let's say my context with the University of Illinois, where I was hired in an American Indian Studies program. And I was hired in that program in part because they were interested in sort of conceptualizing Palestine as an indigenous space, or as a space that can be in conversation, right, with with other colonized communities around the world, in North America particularly. And so I think it's important to locate these problems that Andrew and Dima and Yaman have raised about overzealous policing, overzealous prosecution, state repression, etc. It's we can locate these problems not just as a form of suppression of Palestine solidarity activists, but in a specific framework of American oppression, right? So it was the folks in Chicago who conducted a fishing expedition against Vesmia, right? Well, it's also in Chicago where the police, shot Fred Hampton dead, while he was sleeping, right? So, there are these modes of domestic repression that have been going on for a very long time, and so I believe that it's useful to keep thinking about these Zionist tactics that seem newfangled are actually part of a very long process of policing quote-unquote radical communities in the United States, even though not all Palestine solidarity work is actually radical, right? Some of it's just Palestine solidarity work, but of course, according to the standards of the normative, that work is inherently or necessarily radical, right? And then I guess just as a closing thought, in regard to the kind of fear that ensues because of these sorts of tactics. I think it's deeply important for anybody who wants to be active in issues around Palestine and decolonization to take a close assessment of their own personal circumstances, their own career goals, etc.